The handcuffs clicked before Ifeoma could set down her coffee. Two federal agents in the doorway, badges catching the morning light, behind them standing just far enough back to look like a witness instead of the architect, Min-Jae, her husband. Arms folded, face completely blank. Not angry, not guilty. Blank. Like she was a problem he had already closed. Ifeoma Chukwu, the taller agent, stepped forward. Now, you're being detained on charges of corporate fraud and unauthorized financial transactions totaling $2.3 million. She almost laughed. Almost. Because the number was exact. Because she had shown Min-Jae that exact number. In bed, on a Tuesday night, laptop open between them while he kissed her shoulder and told her she was the most brilliant person he had ever met. She looked at him. He looked at the wall. That was the moment she stopped being his wife and started being his enemy. She just didn't know it yet in words. She knew it the way you know a bone is broken before the pain arrives, the specific, settling certainty of something that cannot be undone. Ifeoma Chukwu had come to San Francisco 6 years earlier with a scholarship, a second-hand laptop, and a mind that processed financial architecture the way other people breathed. She didn't just understand fintech, she felt it. As she saw the inefficiencies in cross-border payment systems the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. Clear, precise, fixable. BridgePay was her fix, a payment bridge for the African diaspora. Instant transfers, low fees, real trust. She had coded it through 2 winters with no heating. She had pitched 31 investors before 2 said yes. She had the rejection emails saved, not out of bitterness, but out of the specific pride of someone who kept going anyway. Min-Jae came into her life in year 3, Korean-American, venture strategist, charming in the precise way that intelligent, calculated men are charming, attentive like it was worship, curious like it was respect. He looked at her pitch deck the way someone looks at a painting they want to own. You're building infrastructure, he told her on their 3rd date. You understand that? This thing is bigger than you know. She married him 14 months later, made him CFO 8 months after that. He called it partnership, called it love. He called it leverage. Looking back, and she would spend a long time looking back, she could identify 17 moments where she should have seen it. The way he always needed access to the code base for investor transparency. The way he quietly moved her 2 most trusted engineers onto secondary projects. The way he inserted himself into every funder meeting until she was the idea and he was the operator. Until rooms looked to him first. As she had called it support, it was extraction. The fraud charges were surgical, false transaction records layered through 3 shell entities, 2 of which carried her digital signature on documents she had never touched. The forensic trail was immaculate. It led directly to her. It led nowhere near him. The arraignment lasted 11 minutes. Her visa status meant ICE was already in the room. No bail, no negotiation. A boarding pass to Lagos pressed into her hand by a government official who couldn't quite meet her eyes. And then she was on a plane at 3 a.m., somewhere over the Atlantic, hands in her lap, watching darkness through the window. She did not cry. Not because she wasn't breaking, but because crying was for people who were surprised. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the specific agony of being destroyed by someone who had kissed her face that same morning, something else was already igniting, something without a soft name. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, made herself one promise. Didn't say it out loud, didn't write it down, just held it in the center of her chest like an ember. 3 years. She would give herself 3 years. Lagos received her the way Lagos receives everyone who comes home broken, loudly, imperfectly, without pity or cruelty. Her mother was at the exit in a wrapper she'd clearly just straightened, face full of worry she was working hard to disguise. They didn't speak in the car. Her mother held her hand the entire way. That was enough. Her childhood bedroom was smaller than she remembered. The ceiling fan clicked on every third rotation. The mattress dipped on the left. She lay on it fully dressed at 2 p.m. and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to quantify exactly what had been taken from her. BridgePay's last valuation, $4.1 million. Her algorithm, the core payment architecture, worth considerably more once it was properly scaled. Her professional network, her U.S. visa, her reputation, her marriage, 4 years of life. These were harder to measure, but she tried anyway, because quantifying things was how she kept herself from dissolving. And the laptop was in her bag, her old personal one. Scratched lid, hackathon sticker, still worked. She opened it, not to grieve what was gone, to start building what came next. Because here was what Min-Jae had miscalculated. In all his surgical precision, in all his document fabrication, in his studied blankness as the handcuffs clicked, he had made one critical error. He thought the algorithm was the asset. It wasn't. She was. And her cousin Temmie had a spare room and good Wi-Fi and the wisdom not to ask too many questions. Temmie filled the kettle before you knew you needed tea. She laughed at things that weren't funny, yet just to remind you that eventually they would be. She was exactly what Ifeoma needed and nothing more. And that precision of care was its own kind of love. The first 2 weeks, Ifeoma read, not fintech, not code, philosophy, game theory, Sun Tzu, and which she'd always dismissed as cliché and now found she had urgent use for. A book by a Nigerian economist about value leakage in informal financial ecosystems. Everything she could find about people who had been publicly destroyed and quietly rebuilt. Not the polished memoir versions, the real ones, with the messy timelines and the humiliating middle chapters. She was looking for a pattern. She found several. The people who came back didn't come back the same way. Had they came back changed, smarter in the broken places, more dangerous in the rebuilt ones. They didn't restore what had been lost. They made it irrelevant. That was week 2. Week 3, she opened the laptop and started building. Not fast, not loud, no announcements, no LinkedIn activity, no appearance at Lagos tech events. Her name was attached to active fraud charges in the U.S. Any visibility was liability. So she moved like smoke, present, real, invisible. And the new architecture was different from BridgePay. Better. She had spent 4 years watching BridgePay's limitations from the inside, and now she knew exactly where the ceiling was and exactly how to build past it. The new system, she called it ARA internally, a name that meant nothing to anyone else, solved problems BridgePay hadn't even attempted, microtransaction routing across 5 African currencies simultaneously. Fraud detection embedded at the core layer, like a settlement architecture that didn't need traditional banking rails. She built it the way she had always built things, by instinct, then by logic, then by deliberately breaking it until she understood every failure point. She brought in 2 engineers she trusted completely. People who had been there before Min-Jae, people who had watched what happened and said nothing publicly and reached out to her privately within weeks of the deportation with short messages that simply said, "I know. And I'm here. Tell me when." She paid them from her savings that were limited. Her mother started leaving extra food outside her door without mentioning it. Ifeoma ate it and didn't mention it either. In San Francisco, Min-Jae was moving fast. Within 3 months of her deportation, he had restructured BridgePay under a new holding entity, Park Digital Partners, rebranded the product, assembled a new team, Yaman begun pitching Series A investors with the kind of polished confidence that makes rooms lean forward. He had her pitch deck, her product, her data, 4 years of her groundwork. He had everything except the thing that made it actually work. Her algorithm was hers, not just legally. It was architecturally hers, built with a logic that was intuitive to her and opaque to everyone else, because that was simply how her mind moved through problems. Layered, oblique, and the documentation she had left behind was thorough on the surface and completely misleading at depth. Not strategically, or maybe in some unacknowledged part of her strategically, but misleading either way. His engineers were competent. They could run it. They could not maintain it. And they could absolutely not fix it when it started to strain under scale, which it began to do around month 4. Quietly first, then louder, and then in the specific way that turns infrastructure issues into a headline. 3,800 users woke one Tuesday to find transactions delayed, not failed, delayed, which is worse, because it means money existed somewhere uncertain, between accounts, between countries, between a person and whatever they needed it for. Customer service collapsed. Social media turned. An investor named Chen Wei sent a very calm email requesting a very urgent call. Min-Jae handled it. And he was always good at handling things. External engineers, a press statement, the right expression in the right room. He had the system stabilized within 10 days, but stabilized was not fixed. The external firm told him this in private. The foundation was compromised. Patching would hold for a while, not forever. He chose to patch. In Lagos, Ifeoma read about the outage in a newsletter. She made morning tea, sat on Temi's balcony, had watched the woman who sold plantain chips at the corner. Busy as always, unhurried, consistent. She felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not happiness, something quieter. The particular satisfaction of watching a lie begin to work against itself. She went inside and coded until midnight. Drop a comment if you felt that opening. The silent war begins now, and she's moving like a shadow while his empire begins to crack. By month 7, ARA had a functioning beta. Not perfect. Close enough to perfect that she could feel the ceiling from where she was standing, and the ceiling was high. She tested it quietly, running it through informal diaspora payment networks she had built through church communities and market associations in Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. The kind of financial flows that traditional banks ignored completely and money transfer operators robbed blind with fees that compounded like punishment. It worked. Every time she broke it, she fixed it faster than the last time. Every fix made the next version harder to break. She was not bridge pay anymore. She had never really been bridge pay. Bridge pay was a version of what she could see in year 1. ARA was what she could see now, after 4 years of watching the limitations up close. And after 7 months of building in silence, after the specific education of being destroyed by someone who thought taking your work was the same as taking your capacity. He had taken the work. She still had the capacity. She was using every part of it. She needed capital, not a large amount. She had made bridge pay run on almost nothing for a long time, and she knew how to build lean. But enough to cross from beta into real infrastructure without compromising her timeline or her silence. The silence was not negotiable. Not yet. Her name was still attached to active charges in the U.S. Any public profile was a target. She didn't make a deck. She didn't pitch a room. She wrote one email to Dr. Adaizi Obiora, Lagos-based investment principal, one of the sharpest minds in African venture capital, a woman Ifeoma had met once at a conference in Accra 4 years ago. They had talked for 40 minutes about the systematic undervaluation of African fintech infrastructure. It's about how Western VC chased consumer products with flashy interfaces while the foundational layer, the actual plumbing of how money moved across the continent, remained underfunded and underbuilt. They had exchanged cards. They had not spoken since. The email was 4 paragraphs. No jargon, no performance, just truth, stripped to the bone. What she was building, why it would work, what she needed, what she was offering in return. Dr. Obiora replied in 6 hours. That I've been watching what happened to you. I've also been watching what's happening to the company that stole your work. Come meet me Friday. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Dr. Obiora brought 2 people Ifeoma hadn't expected, a woman named Sade, who ran a fintech accelerator in Abuja, and a man named Emeka, who introduced himself simply as an interested party, and spent the first 2 hours saying almost nothing. Then, in the last 40 minutes, he asked 6 questions in rapid succession that told Ifeoma he had understood every technical detail she had presented, every risk she had mentioned, and several she hadn't. These were not people who needed convincing. They were people checking whether their conviction was warranted. At the end of hour 3, Dr. Obiora slid a term sheet across the table. "We're calling it a bridge round," she said, and smiled at her own joke. Ifeoma smiled back and concentrated very hard on not letting her hands shake. The number was enough. More than enough. It meant she could hire properly, move into a real space, accelerate without cutting corners on the architecture. It also came with something she hadn't put in her ask, and found she needed more than the money. 3 investors who were fully informed about who she was, what had happened to her, and who actively chose to be in the room anyway. "One condition," Dr. Obiora said, as Ifeoma read through the terms. "You stay invisible. No press, no public profile, no announcing the company until you're ready to announce everything." Ifeoma looked up. "Everything?" "When the time comes," Dr. Obiora said, "you don't just launch a company. You walk back into the room that threw you out. We want to be there when you do." She registered the company as Ara Capital Group. Clean name, no obvious thread leading back to her. A proper office in Victoria Island, small but serious. A glass door, fast internet. The kind of space that communicates to engineers that the work being done inside it matters. She hired 8 people in the first round. 2 engineers who had reached out after watching BridgePay degrade, people who had been there at the beginning, who had seen the original architecture, who had their own quiet rage about what had been taken and who it had been taken from, and 3 new hires who came already angry about what African fintech infrastructure was failing to do. 2 operations leads, 1 lawyer she trusted completely. She told them the truth on day 1. No slides, no company branding. The furniture hadn't even arrived yet. She pulled chairs into a rough circle and told them who she was, what had been taken from her, what she was building, and why the silence was strategy, not shame. Not 1 person left. And that mattered more than she let herself show in the room. She acknowledged it alone, later, sitting in the empty office after everyone had gone, on a chair in the middle of a space that still smelled like fresh paint. She sat with it for exactly 5 minutes. Then she went home and reviewed the architecture notes she'd been holding in her head for 6 months. The growth of ARA over the next year was the kind that happens when you build something genuinely needed and then show up every day and make it better. By month 14, they had 12,000 active users across 4 countries. By month 18, transaction volume had crossed a threshold that earned them serious attention from a major East African payments consortium that had been watching, quietly impressed, from a distance. By month 20, Ara Capital Group, without a single press release, without a profile, without a founder who existed publicly, was worth more than BridgePay had been valued at when Min-Jae stole it. She knew because she was watching his valuation the way a chess player watches the board. Park Digital. Partners had raised its Series A, $4.2 million, from a consortium of Korean-American investors who believed in Min-Jae's vision and his command of a room, that he was extraordinarily good at commanding rooms. He built a narrative about cross-border payment innovation that was compelling enough to fund, and for a while the product held together well enough to sustain the story. But the architecture was still degrading. Slower than it might have been, his patching held better than expected. But the direction was irreversible. The foundation had been built by someone else, for purposes that were specifically hers, and it was not going to hold indefinitely under the weight of someone else's ambition. 2 more outages. The second one hit during a peak remittance weekend, the kind of weekend where thousands of families were sending money home for a wedding, a school term, a hospital bill. The kind of weekend where the money is not abstract, where delay is not an inconvenience. Where your transaction is processing means someone waiting in a hospital corridor or a child who can't register for school on Monday. That outage did not just cost Min-Jae users. It cost him the specific trust that fintech companies spend years building and can lose in 72 hours. The product forums went dark with anger. When a journalist in Nairobi wrote a piece with the headline, "Who is Park Digital Partners and why can't they keep your money safe?" that got shared across 3 continents before his communications team could craft a response. His lead investor, Chen Wei, was no longer sending calm emails. He was requesting board-level access and governance reviews. The board was asking questions Min-Jae was not prepared to answer, and in the particular language of venture capital, that is never loud but is absolutely final. He needed new capital or a technical solution. The technical solution did not exist without rebuilding the foundation, which meant admitting the foundation was built on stolen, incompatible architecture, which meant a conversation that would end him professionally and potentially criminally. He chose to look for acquisition interest instead, quietly, through intermediaries, framing it as strategic partnership exploration, dressing distress in the language of opportunity and calling it growth strategy. Ifeoma's team intercepted the signal in month 22. Emeka, the quiet man, the one who asked 6 perfect questions at a table in Lagos, and had since become one of her most essential allies, came to her office on a Thursday afternoon with a folder. He set it on her desk and said simply, his debt structure, his investor relations status, his current acquisition interest, all of it. She read it twice, slowly. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked out the window at Lagos. The cranes over the marina, the traffic already building at 4 p.m., the heat haze sitting over the water like something alive. She let herself feel it, the full weight of what the next move meant. She had not let herself picture this moment too clearly before now. And because picturing it early would have made her impatient, and impatience would have made her visible. But now, it was here. The board was set. The position was available. And she was ready. "How much to acquire his debt?" she asked. Emeka named a number. It was significant. It was achievable. "I want all of it," she said. "Every note. Anonymously. Through the Singapore entity." He nodded. He had expected this. "And I want to be sitting in that boardroom in Seoul," she said. When he finds out who bought it." He nodded again. He had expected that too. She spent the next 6 weeks in a focused, almost meditative state of preparation. Legal team briefed, documentation assembled. The forensic reconstruction of BridgePay's original algorithm, cross-referenced line by line against Park Digital Partners' current codebase, reviewed and certified by 3 independent technical experts across 2 jurisdictions. The similarity index was 97.3%. It was not ambiguous. It was not circumstantial. It was the kind of evidence that ends arguments before they start. She also, quietly, had her U.S. legal team reopen the original fraud case with the new documentation. The false transaction records that had been used to frame her, she had spent 2 years building the counter-evidence. Not because she needed it for the Seoul move, but because she refused to let the charge stand. She refused to let the fiction of her guilt remain in a file somewhere, undisputed. It was not about clearing her name publicly. It was about the truth existing on record in the place where the lie had been told. The filing was submitted 6 weeks before she booked her flight to Seoul. She told her team. She told Dr. Obiora and Seide and Amika. She called her mother and said, "It's almost time." Her mother said, "Eat something first." She laughed, the real kind, the kind that had been in short supply for 2.5 years. Then she went back to her desk, opened her laptop, and then started reviewing the boardroom presentation she was going to walk into Min-Jae's life with. It was clean. It was precise. It contained no rage. It did not need to. The most devastating things rarely do. Meanwhile, Park Digital Partners continued its polite, accelerating collapse. 2 board members had begun the process of formally requesting Min-Jae step back from operational control pending a governance review. A 3rd investor had engaged their own legal counsel to evaluate exposure. And the engineering team was running on a combination of patched code, genuine talent stretched past its limits, and the particular exhaustion of people who know they are holding something together that should not be held together. One of those engineers, a young woman named Hyun, who had joined Park Digital Partners 8 months ago because the pitch had sounded like something real, sent a message to a former colleague that week. She said, "I think the product is fundamentally broken. I think leadership knows. I don't know what to do." Her former colleague forwarded the message to someone who forwarded it to someone who forwarded it to a journalist at a Korean tech publication who filed it under "Watch This Space." Everyone was watching Min-Jae's space. No one was watching Ifeoma's. That was exactly how she had designed it. She booked business class because she needed the sleep and could not afford to arrive in Seoul with anything less than a completely rested mind. Then she packed light. 1 bag, 1 suit the color of midnight, the small gold earrings her mother had pressed into her palm at Murtala Muhammad Airport with both hands, and a look that said everything she didn't have words for. "Come back with your name clean," her mother said. "I'm coming back with more than that," Ifeoma said. She boarded the flight. She slept 4 hours. She landed in Seoul at 6:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, took a cab from Incheon. I checked into a quiet hotel in Gangnam, 3 blocks from the Park Digital Partners building. She was there for 4 days before anyone connected to Min-Jae knew she was in the country. She used those 4 days to walk the city, not for sentiment, for grounding. She needed to be present in her body before she walked into that room. Not running on adrenaline, not running on anger, not running on the memory of handcuffs and an Atlantic flight and a ceiling fan that clicked on the 3rd rotation. A running on herself, the version of herself that had been built in the last 30 months. She was ready to introduce that version to the man who thought he had finished her. If you're still here, you already know what's coming. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to see what a real comeback looks like. Act 3. The hostile takeover is the one you came for. The shadow is finally stepping into the light. She did not walk into the building like a main character. That was intentional. No announcement, no entourage. She arrived at the Park Digital Partners boardroom 4 minutes before the scheduled start time. Not early enough to seem nervous, not late enough to seem theatrical. She carried 1 folder and her phone. She wore the midnight suit, the gold earrings, nothing else. She looked like someone who was completely certain of where she was going because she had been walking toward this room for 2.5 years. The conference room was on the 14th floor. Glass walls. Seoul spread out behind them, gray-skied, enormous, indifferent. 7 investors around the table, 2 sets of lawyers on opposite sides, a CFO who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and a communications director who was already reading the room for damage before anything had been said. And Min-Jae walked in 90 seconds after she sat down. Mid-sentence to his CFO. Jacket on, phone in hand, the particular energy of a man performing control. Then he looked up and the sentence stopped. The phone stayed in his hand, but he wasn't holding it anymore. He was just standing. In the doorway of his own boardroom, looking at his ex-wife who was supposed to be in Lagos, who was supposed to be destroyed, who was sitting across his conference table like she owned it, because she did. Yet the CFO looked between them. Someone coughed. A junior staffer froze outside the glass wall with a tray of coffee cups, reading the temperature of the room. Ifeoma. His voice had the sound of a calculation going catastrophically wrong. Sit down, Min-Jae, she said. Completely level. No warmth and no venom. The tone of someone who has already won and is simply administering the result. He sat down. She let 2 seconds of silence hold before she opened the folder. My name is Ifeoma Chukwu, for CEO of Ara Capital Group. For those of you who don't know me yet, you will. She looked around the table slowly, making brief contact with each investor. Ara Capital Group is now the primary holder of Park Digital Partners' outstanding debt, acquired through a Singapore-based intermediary vehicle over the past 6 weeks. I have the documentation here for each of you. She slid copies down the table. Clean, tabbed, everything labeled. The terms of the acquisition give Ara Capital Group operational authority in the event of default. Park Digital Partners is currently in technical default on 2 of the 3 primary debt instruments. She paused, looked at Min-Jae's lawyer, who was already leaning sideways to speak into Min-Jae's ear. Your legal team has been notified. The paperwork was filed yesterday morning. The room was very quiet. Chen Wei, the sharp-faced lead investor who had been the first to raise governance concerns, was reading the documents with the focused stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this before and knew exactly what he was holding. There's a second matter, Ifeoma said. She reached into the folder and placed another document at the center of the table. This is a forensic technical reconstruction of BridgePay's original payment algorithm, cross-referenced with the code base currently running Park Digital Partners' core infrastructure. The comparison was conducted by 3 independent experts across 2 jurisdictions. The similarity index is 97.3%. She looked at Min-Jae for the first time since she had started speaking. He was looking at the document, not at her. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. The blankness she remembered from the doorway in San Francisco, that studied, perfect blankness, was gone. What was underneath it was not guilt and not rage. It was the specific expression of someone watching the walls come down in real time and understanding that every door is already locked. BridgePay was my algorithm, she said. My architecture. My 4 years. Your company has been running on stolen intellectual property since the day it launched. The legal filing in 3 jurisdictions was submitted yesterday alongside the debt documentation. She leaned forward slightly. The 2 filings reference each other. Your lawyers will explain what that means for your personal liability. Min-Jae's lawyer touched his arm. Min-Jae didn't move. Ifeoma. His voice was smaller. The particular register of a man whose performance has finally run out of stage. She held up one hand. Don't, she said. Just that word. And the room held it. Chen-wei set down his copy of the forensic report. He looked at Min-Jae for a long moment. Then he looked at Ifeoma. Then he said, and very quietly, "How long have you been building toward this?" 2 years, 7 months, she said, give or take. He nodded. Like that was the answer he expected, like he respected it. The vote to restructure under Ara Capital's terms took 38 minutes. It was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was rational. 7 investors who had placed real capital into a company now understood to have been founded on intellectual property theft. Presented with a restructuring framework that protected the majority of their investment and gave the company a viable technical future, chose the framework. One by one, clean hands in the air, no speeches, no emotion, just the sound of an empire being signed over in increments. Min-Jae retained a 4% equity stake in the restructured entity. Her lawyers had negotiated this in the final session against the wishes of 2 investors who wanted him fully diluted. So she had agreed to the 4% not out of mercy. She was not in a mercy mood, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but out of strategy. She wanted no narrative in which he was the fully dispossessed victim. Let him keep 4%. Let him sit with 4% of what he had stolen while she ran the other 96%. Let that be his daily reality for as long as the company existed. She walked out of the building at 2:47 p.m. Her legal team was waiting on the pavement. Her assistant handed her a bottle of water. She drank it standing on the street in front of the building with cars moving past and Seoul going about its enormous, indifferent business around her. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She had expected triumph, the hot cinematic kind, the swell of music, the slow-motion walk. She had imagined this moment often enough in her darker nights that she had a mental version of it with a full soundtrack. What she actually felt was quieter than that, deeper, and the specific satisfaction of something that has been true the whole time finally becoming visible, the relief of a lie being publicly corrected, and underneath both of those, something that surprised her, something close to grief. Not for Min-Jae, not for the marriage, for the version of herself that had trusted so completely and been so completely wrong. She let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took to finish the water. Then she handed the empty bottle to her assistant and said, "Get me on the earliest flight to Lagos." The press release went out that evening. Corporate language, careful, acquisition, restructuring, new strategic leadership. It did not mention fraud. It did not mention a marriage or a deportation or a plane flight over a dark ocean. It didn't need to. The tech press connected the dots in under 24 hours. And her name appeared in 4 publications before midnight, each story slightly more accurate than the last, each one reconstructing the timeline with increasing clarity and increasing outrage. The fraud charges against her in the U.S., dropped 6 months earlier when her legal team submitted the counter-evidence, were mentioned. The original bridge pay algorithm was mentioned. And the phrase orchestrated deportation appeared in a TechPoint Africa piece that was shared 41,000 times by breakfast. By morning, she was trending in Nigeria, South Korea, and the United States simultaneously. She did not read the coverage until she was back in her hotel room at 11 p.m. Shoes off, sitting on the bed with the laptop and a plate of food her assistant had ordered because she hadn't eaten since 7 a.m. Thus she read enough to know the story was being told correctly, that the shape of what had happened was now public, visible, on record, where it could not be quietly revised. Then she closed the laptop and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. It was 4 a.m. in Lagos. "Mama," Ifeoma said, "it's done." A pause. Then her mother crying, not softly, not for decorum, the real kind, the kind that has been waiting 2.5 years for permission. Ifeoma pressed the phone against her ear, stared at the ceiling of her Seoul hotel room. Let her mother cry for both of them. She spent 4 more days in Seoul, not for theater, for work. She met with the engineering team, 26 people who had been building on a compromised foundation and hadn't known the full extent of it until now. She was honest with them the way she had been honest with her own team on day 1. And she sat in their open plan office and told them what the company had been running on, what the restructuring meant for the product, and what she intended to build in its place. She told them every person in that room had a choice, and that she respected whatever they chose. 22 of them stayed. She took that number home with her like a second piece of evidence, proof that the work was real, proof that people who understood what they were building wanted to keep building it, and even now that the foundation was being replaced. 22 engineers choosing to stay was not a small thing. It was the beginning of the next chapter. She walked the office floor on her last morning, early, before the team arrived. The space had too much glass, and the kind of minimalist aesthetic that communicates ambition before anything is said. She had been in offices like this before. She had built one herself, long ago, in a city she still couldn't fully enter. She stopped at the window. The 14th floor, Seoul below. Organized, relentless, extraordinary in the specific way of cities that rebuilt themselves from rubble and then kept building. She had thought about Seoul's reconstruction during her harder nights in Lagos, about what it meant to come back, changed rather than restored. She had decided at some point, she couldn't remember exactly when, that she didn't want restoration. Restoration meant going back to what she was. She wanted to go forward into what she was becoming. Standing at that window, she thought she could feel the difference. She thought about the woman who had pressed her forehead to a plane window over the Atlantic, who had made one quiet promise and then kept it for 31 months with no audience and no guarantee, who had coasted through Lagos heat and Lagos noise and the specific loneliness of building something that could not exist publicly yet. Sue, who had eaten her mother's jollof rice and pretended not to notice her mother checking the Wi-Fi data usage, who had cried exactly once, the night before the Seoul trip, alone in her apartment briefly with the lights off, and then gotten up and finished packing. She thought about Temi's kettle, Dr. Obiora's term sheet, Emeka's 6 questions, 22 engineers. The small gold earrings pressed into her palm at the airport. So she thought about the fact that she was standing in a building she now owned, in a city she had chosen, looking down at a skyline that had nothing to do with her story until she made it part of her story. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Obiora. Lagos is watching. Come home. She typed back. Friday. I'll bring the champagne. Then she put her phone in her pocket and let herself have the view for 1 more minute. Not because she needed more time, because she had paid for this moment in full and she was not going to rush past it. Then she picked up her bag, walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor. There was work to do. Comment right now if you felt that boardroom scene. 1 word. That's all. Act 4. The final move is the one that will stay with you forever. The debt is finally being paid in full. The thing most profiles written about Ifeoma in the months that followed got slightly wrong was the revenge part. They called it a stunning reversal, a calculated act of payback, a corporate comeback story for the ages. The word revenge moved through their copy like something they couldn't help reaching for. Because the story had the shape of revenge, the wronged woman, the corrupt man, the surgical acquisition, and it was irresistible copy, and she understood the instinct. She never corrected anyone who wrote it, but what she knew in the private architecture of herself was that revenge had not been the engine. Revenge is hot. Revenge is reactive. Revenge keeps you oriented toward the person who hurt you, keeps them at the center of your frame. Gives them ongoing residence in your mental real estate long after they deserve eviction. She had felt the rage. She would not pretend she hadn't. Those first weeks in Lagos, the 4 a.m. sessions when grief sat on her chest like a physical object, and she had scrolled Min-Jae's LinkedIn with a feeling she didn't have clean words for. She had felt all of it, but she had chosen not to run on it. She had run on something colder and more sustainable, the knowledge that she was good, that what she built was real, that the algorithm was hers not because she could prove it in a courtroom. She couldn't. He had made sure of that. But because it lived in her mind in a way it could never live in his. That everything he had taken was replaceable because she was the source. You can steal a river, but you cannot steal the rain. She had run on that, and on her mother's hand in a car from the airport, and on Temmie's kettle, and on 22 engineers choosing to stay, and on the patient, accumulating satisfaction of building something better than what had been taken. That was not revenge. That was something older and more powerful than revenge. That was proof. The U.S. charges were formally dropped 4 months after Seoul. Her legal team received the notice on a Thursday morning and sent it to her with a single line. "It's official. You're clear." She was in a meeting when it arrived. She read it under the table. Now, she felt something move through her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the removal of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it. She excused herself, walked to the bathroom, stood at the sink for 60 seconds, then went back to the meeting. Her visa status was restored 7 months later. The question of whether to return to San Francisco was one she sat with deliberately. She turned it in her hands for weeks. The city had been the location of the worst thing that had happened to her. It had also been the location of 6 of the most formative years of her professional life. 2 of her closest friends still lived there. The ecosystem that had first taken her seriously existed there. She refused to let one man determine her relationship to a city. That would be giving him a second theft she hadn't authorized. She went back for a conference the following spring. She spoke on a panel about African fintech infrastructure and what it would take to build it properly. She did not make a statement about what had happened. She did not give one-on-one interviews. She showed up, said what she knew, shook hands with people she respected, had dinner with 2 former colleagues who had quietly maintained their belief in her through everything, and flew home to Lagos. Home. She had stopped putting quotation marks around that word, even mentally. Lagos was not a consolation prize for losing San Francisco. Lagos was the place where she had built something real, where her mother made tea without being asked, where the woman on the corner sold plantain chips through every kind of weather without complaint, where 22 engineers, who had never met her before she hired them, had chosen to bet their professional lives on what she was building. Lagos was not where she had ended up. It was where she had chosen to be. Ifeoma moved into a larger space the year after Seoul. The Seoul office became a regional hub. The Nairobi operation opened 14 months after the acquisition and was profitable within 8. Transaction volume crossed the number she had written in her notebook on a Tuesday night in her childhood bedroom. Ceiling fan clicking, mattress dipping on the left, unsure if any of it was possible. She still had that notebook. She found it during a move. She drew a small, clean line through the number. Not a celebration, an acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge a promise kept. The second year after Seoul, she gave her first major interview, not because she owed the story to anyone, because the story had a shape that was useful to people who needed to see it. She chose a journalist she had respected for years, a woman who wrote about African technology without the condescension that infected so much coverage of the continent. They talked for 3 hours in the Lagos office. The published piece ran 8,000 words and opened with the sentence, "Ifeoma Chukwu does not describe what happened to her as a comeback, because a comeback implies you were gone." She read that line and felt it land correctly. She saved the article. She did not frame it. Min-Jae Park's name moved through the legal proceedings and then receded. She did not seek to amplify his humiliation beyond what the facts required. The filings were public. The similarity index was public. The debt acquisition was public. She had not hidden anything or protected him from the natural consequences of what he had done. But she had also not built her company around making him suffer. She had built her company around making something real. Those were different projects, and she was only interested in one of them. He would live with what he had done. With the specific, the private knowledge of what he had thrown away and what it had become. What it had always been capable of becoming if he had not mistaken the product for the person. He would wake up every morning with 4% of a company run by a woman he had tried to finish. That was its own kind of sentence, and she had not needed to write it. She had simply let the math do its work. She hired Hyun, the young engineer who had sent the message saying, "I think the product is fundamentally broken," within 3 months of the acquisition. Hyun came to the interview expecting to be asked about what she knew about Park Digital Partners and when she knew it. Ifeoma asked her instead about what she would build if the foundation were sound, what the product could be if the architecture actually worked, what she cared about. The interview lasted an hour. Ifeoma hired her on the spot. Hyun would go on to lead the Seoul office's engineering team. She would, in a later interview of her own, say that the first thing Ifeoma told her on her first day was, "The best thing you can do with a bad experience is understand it completely and then build past it." Hyun would say she wrote it down. She still had it. There was a morning 2 years after Seoul that Ifeoma would return to more than any other moment. Not the boardroom, not the trending hashtag, not the legal notice that cleared her name. A morning in the Lagos office early before most of the team had arrived. She was at her desk with coffee, working through a code review she needed to finish before a 9 a.m. call. Through the glass wall, she could see the city waking up. Light coming in off the water, the sound of traffic beginning to build, someone in the office kitchen running a tap. An engineer knocked on the glass, put her head in. Young, 24. And she had relocated from Enugu 6 months ago for this job. "I've been here a year this week," she said. She looked mildly embarrassed by her own sincerity, but continued anyway. "I know what this company is, and I know who built it. I don't take that for granted." She said it and disappeared back to her desk before Ifeoma could respond. Ifeoma sat with that for a full minute. Not because she needed external validation. She had done the work of not needing it in the way she once had. She sat with it because it was real, and she had learned, the hard way, not to move through real things quickly. Real things were the point. Real things were what all of it had been for. The company kept growing. Not perfectly. No company does. There were quarters that challenged her, product decisions she got wrong on the first attempt, a funding round that took 3 months longer than projected and aged her slightly. There were days when the weight of running something at that scale pressed down on her in ways she hadn't anticipated, when she sat at her desk at 10 p.m. with the feeling that the distance between where she was and where she was trying to go was not closing fast enough. On those nights, she did not scroll Min-Jae's LinkedIn. She did not think about the boardroom. She thought about the engineer from Enugu, about Hyun in Seoul, and about the 12,000 users who had been there before the Series A, using a product no one knew existed, trusting it with their money because it worked. She thought about what they needed from her, and then she figured out the next thing and did it. That was not dramatic. It was not the stuff of profiles. It was the actual texture of building something real. The unglamorous, daily, non-negotiable showing up. The choosing, again and again, to be the source rather than the echo of what had been taken. She spoke at a conference in Nairobi in the third year after Seoul, on a panel about resilience in African entrepreneurship, a topic she had complicated feelings about, because resilience was often the word used to make people feel noble about structural problems that should simply not exist. But she agreed to the panel and she said what she actually thought, which was this: the story gets told as resilience, as comeback, as triumph over adversity. And those things are real, but I want to be honest about what it actually cost. It cost 2.5 years. It cost a marriage I believed in. It cost a company I had built from nothing and a city I loved and time I will not get back. I'm not standing here to tell you that the cost was worth it in the way that phrase usually means, as though suffering has a redemptive quality in itself. The suffering did not make me better. What made me better was choosing, every day, what to do with the time after the suffering. That is not the same thing, and I think we should be very careful about which one we celebrate. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true has been said without decoration. And then someone in the third row started clapping, and the rest of the room followed, and Ifeoma stood at the podium and let it happen, and thought about a plane over the Atlantic, and a ceiling fan that clicked on the third rotation, and a laptop with a hackathon sticker that still worked. She thought about the ember she had held in her chest all those months, the quiet promise made with no witnesses. She had kept it. That was the thing, in the end, that she was most proud of. Not the acquisition, and not the trending hashtag, not the forensic report with its damning similarity index. She was most proud of the fact that she had made a promise to herself in the dark, with no audience and no guarantee, and she had kept it, completely. Over 31 months. Without breaking? Without shortcuts? Without becoming someone she didn't recognize. She had walked into the fire that had been built for her, and she had walked out on the other side carrying something the fire hadn't been able to touch. Shatata. Some betrayals are designed to be final, built to take everything: your name, your work, your standing, the precise coordinates of the life you were assembling, executed by people who have studied you closely enough to know where the load-bearing walls are, brought down with the efficiency of someone who used to love you. What those betrayals cannot account for is the builder, the person who, on a plane over an uncaring ocean, does not cry. Us who lands in the place they started and opens a laptop and begins again. Who moves like smoke for 2 years and builds in silence and runs on the cold, renewable knowledge that they are the source, that the thing taken from them lives in them in a way it can never live in anyone else. Ifeoma Chukwu did not get her life back. She built a better one, without losing herself to the process, without letting the coldest chapter make her permanently cold, without allowing one man's calculation to become the permanent ceiling of her ambition or the permanent temperature of her trust. From Lagos to Seoul, from handcuffs to the 14th floor, from a second-hand laptop with a hackathon sticker to a company that moved money across a continent for people the old system had decided to ignore. From betrayal to this. Some victories are worth the wait. If this story held you from the first line to the last, subscribe, share it. I said drop in the comments. What was the moment that got you? The handcuffs, the email, the boardroom, or that last quiet morning in Lagos? Because the best part of a story like this isn't the revenge, it's the proof.